Distinguished diplomats from the Brazilian Embassy, welcome to the Diplomatic Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for us to host such a notable guest at the Matías Romero Institute. Mexico and Brazil are celebrating 190 years of diplomatic relations. This year has been declared as a dual year between Mexico and Brazil. That is why we are very pleased with the celebration of today's event. As you may be aware, the Matías Romero Institute is the Diplomatic Academy of Mexico, a place of excellence for knowledge dissemination and for the training of Mexican and foreign diplomats. I believe that it is of the utmost importance that the Mexican public learn a little more about the joint peacekeeping operations and the role of Brazil, which has been very important in the last years. Once again, I welcome you to this institute, an ideal space to learn more about other countries, as well as to strengthen academic diplomatic cooperation with them. And now I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to read your CV. Dr. Kai Kenkel is an associate professor at the Institute for International Relations at the Pontificia Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. He is the founding general coordinator of the Democracy and Armed Forces Nucleus at the Catholic Pontifical University. From 2022 to 2023 academic year, he was a distinguished visiting scholar of the Dartmouth Initiative for Global Security at the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College in the United States. Since 2014, he has been a research associate at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, where he completed a postdoctoral period in 2016 to 2017. He holds a doctorate and master's degree from the Instituto Universidad de Haute Études Internationales in Geneva, and a bachelor's degree from Johns Hopkins University. He has taught at renowned universities in Brazil, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and the Czech Republic. From 2013 to 2016, he was postgraduate coordinator of the International Relations Institute of the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro. IRIPUC is that, no? Okay, and from 2010 to 2013, editor of the magazine Contexto Internacional. He was director of institutional relations of the Brazilian Association of Defense Studies from 2014 to 2016. He publishes in the areas of peace operations, humanitarian interventions, responsibility to protect, civil-military relations, light weapons, and the South Atlantic. He teaches and guides in the area of international security, with emphasis on intervention issues and peace operations. Nuevamente, seja bem-vindo aqui à Academia Diplomática, e please enlighten us about the role of Brazil in the peacekeeping operations.
Hold on to it. So thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Sorry for doing this in English as well. Es que cuando trato de hablar en español me viene un portuñol atroz, entonces no voy a insistir. And I also have to add that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Brazilian embassy, especially since I'm only going to be a citizen by the end of the year of the country. So we'll talk briefly about today emerging powers and UN peacekeeping, the case of Brazil. And as I talk about the Brazilian case and some of the conceptual aspects of this, I was just hoping that rather than sort of putting Brazil there as a model, that we maybe think about what some of the parallels are to the Mexican experience, what Mexico could glean from this, and also, of course, what Mexico would do differently based on its own traditions, right? So first I'll talk about why states in general participate in peace operations. And what we've taken there is a model taken from the Providing for Peacekeeping project that was done by the International Peace Institute. And we basically have 5 reasons, 5 rationales why states, or 5 categories of rationales why states participate in peacekeeping operations, in UN peacekeeping operations. That is political, economic, security, institutional, and normative rationales. I am feeling the altitude a little bit, so I'm sorry. I'll try and speak into the mic and not project as much so I don't end up. Okay, let's go. So political rationales then. Come on. Political rationales largely have to do mostly what we do in this house, so diplomatic reasons. So the perception that peacekeeping contributions enhance a country's national prestige. It happens when you, as in the case of Germany, for example, when you receive a lot of pressure from allies or alliance partners to join as well, or even from the UN Secretariat or from great powers, right? Brazil also had sort of a little bit of pressure when they started, it was sort of kicked off by the US absence and by a French interest in their participating in Haiti, for example. There's a perception clearly in the Brazilian case as well that peacekeeping contributions can strengthen a country's international influence, and particularly rising powers or emerging powers can see UN peacekeeping as a useful foreign policy tool, especially if they can be seen as providing an input to a global good or a regional, sort of a regional order, right? So there is also sort of an interaction between Mexico and Brazil on this. I know that there was a keen awareness of, in 2004, when Brazil became more involved with Haiti and MINUSTAH, there was a keen awareness here that this was kind of a move for more regional influence, right? So it's clearly tied to that as well. Where do I need to aim this so that it works? Here? That would be why it wasn't working. There we go. Economic rationales. In the Mexican case, I don't think this would happen, because what an economic rationale basically means you can make money off of sending troops to peace operations, right? So the UN reimburses at a fixed rate, about $1,100 for a normal soldier, for an enlisted soldier, per troop per month, right? So if you pay them less than that, if you pay them like Bangladesh $500, you're getting $600 per troop per month that goes directly as excess into your budget. Not the case for Brazil, not the case for Mexico. At the same time, Uruguay has about 60–70% of their defense budget at a given time came from UN reimbursements. They made a lot of money off of UN peacekeeping, right? And so this can be good for national governments if it goes back into the normal budget. It can be very good for the security sector, for the armed forces, if it goes back into the defense budget. And it can be also, by the way, very good as an individual motivation for both the military and civilians, as they can gain quite a bit of money from this as well, personally. There are security rationales, obviously, as well. And those have to do with kind of geopolitical outcomes, defense policy outcomes, when you want to ensure a certain outcome in a conflict. So Mexico might, for example, have interests if there are open armed conflicts that arise in Central America, right? There are interests there that can be assured, that can be protected by involving yourself as a peacekeeping force in there. And there are also sort of traditional strategic motivations that had to do with the closer environment or neighboring states as well. Institutional rationales have to do with the interests of specific governmental bodies in the sending state, in the country that is sending troops to the peacekeeping operation. That is to say, there will be interests from the armed forces, there'll be interests from the Cancilleria, there'll be interests from different parts of the state itself, including even the presidency and the executive branch. So this has a lot to do with the state of civilian control over the armed forces. It has a lot to do, for example, with whether the armed forces consider this mission to be prestigious and whether they're involved in internal missions as well. And it has to do with the attractiveness of peacekeeping as a source of operational experience for the military as well, right? So it's a way, it's often seen as a way of preventing the military from interfering in domestic politics, of making a coup less likely. It's seen as a way of rehabilitating the armed forces after a period of authoritarianism. And it provides the armed forces with sort of an acceptable, even prestigious role after their image has been tarnished, if in fact that is the case. In terms of normative rationales, this also has quite a bit to do with the diplomatic side, right? If there's an interest, if a diplomatic establishment has an interest in being seen to be contributing to multilateral institutions, if the multilateral approach is important to the diplomatic service, then to be seen as contributing to that, to be seen as punching above your weight, to be seen as a good international citizen, right? Peacekeeping operations are clearly a way of contributing to that, right? And that also has to do with, in certain cases of rising powers, particularly the drive for more influence in specific decision-making bodies, such as the Security Council, right? So we can move then to looking at where peace operations themselves, I'm going the wrong way, where peace operations themselves are actually headed at this particular point in time. And we get to the first point, which is that there has been an administrative rethink recently, or relatively recently, at the United Nations, that we now divide more political aspects from the logistical aspects of peace operations, right? And that also opens the way for different types of contribution from different states, especially in the global south, right? We have an increasing insistence or emphasis in mandates in coming from the Security Council on the protection of civilians. And what that, I mean, that is, on the surface of it, that's a laudable goal. In practice, in the field, that means more militarization, more use, more propensity to use force, potentially. And it changes the character in certain ways of peace operations that have consequences for states in the global south and their views of the use of force, right? We have an approach coming from the United Nations that uses, that is more heavily based on involving neighboring states, and that has a lot to do with migration flows and also occupations and access to natural resources, as it were. What this has led to over the past is sort of what we've called Christmas tree mandates, right? Or overloaded mandates, where there isn't kind of a clear aim to the mission. You have sort of a basic structure and then hang all kinds of other things on it. It makes the missions less effective, but is also, there hasn't been much provided in the way of ways of drafting or mechanisms for drafting these resolutions that would structure this a little bit better. And as a result, we have an increased reliance on the use of force. And we'll get to why that is of relevance for states in Latin America as well, right? So what that had as a consequence is a larger focus on stabilization initiatives, right? So if we look at what peace operations have been doing for the past 20, 25 years, right? They've been focused on the well-being of the local population. They've been doing that potentially in a neoliberal, in a liberal way, but they've been focused on the welfare of the local population. So we've had soldiers doing civilian jobs, but they're doing civilian jobs. In stabilization missions, these come from a completely different place, and they prioritize military goals. And they're putting the local population much more in second place compared to security goals and military goals. So where are operations headed? What we see is a lot of large liberal peace building missions closing. Mali's closing, Sudan will close, Congo is shutting down, right? Those huge missions that have been running for 10, 15 years and have billion-dollar yearly budgets are coming to a close. They're being replaced by what you could call sort of an opening of scissors, where on the one hand, you have these very light footprint special political missions. On the other hand, you have these extremely robust, extremely militarized, extremely also westernized stabilization missions. And there's very little in between. And what gets lost in that in-between space is the preoccupation primarily with the local populations, which is precisely what countries in the global south, such as Brazil, are good at. So it's a movement, it's a development in those peace operations that isn't good for the utility of these missions for various things for countries in the global south. They're bad for civil military relations, and they've moved away from what global south states are particularly somewhat better at, right? There's been budget cuts all around. Everyone is sort of sitting, waiting to see how the US election turns out as well, because the Trump government had a very strong effect of taking money and emphasis away from multilateral solutions, away from peace operations. So if he is reelected, in fact, this is sort of sending shivers through the corridors, I imagine, in the United Nations. So there's, at the same time, though, there's been kind of a rediscovery of geopolitics. So as we jostle for position in the global south, we can see how, the global south, Latin America in particular, has become this chessboard again for American and Chinese economic and geopolitical interests. And the agency has been sucked out of the global south a little bit compared to 20 years ago, for example, when we had the first Lula government, right? So it's a different situation, and great powers have kind of rediscovered geopolitics, rediscovered unilateral action, and they've rediscovered peace operations, not as something that's done where they don't have interests, but something that is done to fulfill their interests. So they've been kind of recaptured by major powers. And the limits have been shown for us by Syria, by Yemen, by Mali, by the Central African Republic, and now we're seeing it in the day-to-day practice a little bit closer to home here in Haiti as well. So stabilization operations, what stabilization operations do is they help a host state fight its enemies. So counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, against secessionist movements, and so on. And what they do is they subordinate protection of civilians, they subordinate the preoccupation with development or with the local population to military defeat of those enemies, right? And so peace sort of becomes another military buzzword among others. It changes the focus very strongly, and this practice very clearly has its origins in NATO practice, right? But what's the problem here? Why is this interesting for us? What does this mean for us in the global south, or in the Brazilian case? NATO, the Americans, are very, very good at winning wars and very, very bad at what comes afterwards, right? The global south is a little bit the converse. We don't really have the capacity to project force and win wars, obviously, the way the Americans do, the way NATO does, but we're very good at root causes. We're very good at that first step in development at home. We have that experience at home. So we can export that experience, and it becomes sort of a global division of labor, where the pointy end of the stick can be done by NATO, and the root causes and making sure it doesn't happen again could be, in theory, taken up more by the global south. And it's a way then for global south states that have these development policies at home, basically by doing peace building, to contribute to global security and therefore attain a higher diplomatic impact by doing development. Right? It's a backdoor, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Right? So with stabilization, less focus on the local population, more focus on military goals, and more use of force. It incites to more use of force. So liberal peace building has become, in a way, a little bit like the Cold War, in the sense that while we were in it, we loved to criticize it, and now that it's gone, we wish it would come back. right? Like things were easier, things were clearer, right? And in a sense, sort of liberal peace building is quite similar. And it's about control rather than humanity, let's say, right? And stabilization, particularly in a place like Brazil, the way it's done with counterinsurgency, it has a tendency to remind us of the Cold War. It has a tendency to remind us of domestic missions for the armed forces that are problematic in various ways, right? And it has a tendency then for us to look at it and say, maybe this isn't the experience we want our armed forces to have, right? And it occasionally results, even when done by NATO, in what has been termed in Afghanistan, pacification by destruction, right? So the attractiveness of this is a different story. And so these missions, they're born of kind of neoliberal shock therapies in the 1980s. They start for the first time with the stabilization force in Bosnia in 1996, right? And we have various kind of very strong stabilization mandates in Haiti, in Central African Republic, in Mali, and in Congo, right? But we're losing empathy and compassion, and we're coming in with military force and anti-terrorism, basically. So things change. I'm going to skip over just one slide here. I'm going the wrong way again. There we go. So that said, we've kind of put down the conceptual idea now. Let's look at how this is translated into the Brazilian case then. A conceptual look, and we're going to benchmark, we're going to put the kind of reduce this by looking at the time when Brazil was in MINUSTAH from 2004 to 2017, right? So a conceptual look at the Brazilian case. We want to look at Brazil in that case as an emerging power, right? So there are kind of a series of approaches to emerging powers, but we're going to look at emerging powers in terms of behavior and in terms of sort of diplomatic functions. Now, there is obviously an invitation to tautology there that we want to avoid. And we say, so how does Brazil act? Well, it acts like an emerging power. Okay, how do emerging powers act? Well, they act like Brazil. So it doesn't help us, but there are certain hallmarks of emerging power behavior, particularly as they relate to peace operations, that we can focus on. So we're going to look at what emerging powers, what that means, where they come from, how that concept is relevant, how that relates to particularly those states' interactions, participation in peace operations, and we're going to look at peace building in particular and the Brazilian experience there. So let's think about, as we look at this emerging power definition, whether Mexico fits this mold as well, and what might be there what might or may not be there as an orientation based on the local traditions here as well. So generally, emerging powers today are seen as kind of a subset of middle powers, and they are states who attained middle power status after the Cold War. And they are largely, to a very large extent, post-colonial states as well. So in their foreign policy, these states, typically as global actors, to the extent that they are global actors, they also have more of a regional horizon, but to the extent that they are global actors, tend to prefer economic issues to strategic questions, to military questions in their foreign policy. Frequently, it's the case that these states are less internally consolidated. So there's economic disequalities, there's problems with civilian control, there's other issues that have to do with internal consolidations, which has consequences for how they can project themselves as civilian powers internationally. And these countries are generally situated at the periphery of the global production complex. So there are two main differences between established and emerging emerging powers in this sense, middle powers in this sense, right? Traditional middle powers, let's say Canada, Australia, Japan, Norway, they tend to support the status quo ante, right? Emerging powers are much more revisionist. And the question is sort of, do you adapt? Do you try to rise in this system? Or do you question the hierarchy of the system as you're trying to rise in it? And peace building, again, is another way of doing that, right? So these countries are often accused of ambivalence, right, towards say, multilateral institutions. You can take a Brazilian representative in the Security Council, for example. You'll have 2 meetings in one day. In the morning, the representative will be quoted saying, well, listen, the only legitimate body we have for dealing with this question is right here in the Security Council. And then next meeting after lunch, well, this council is never going to be fully legitimate unless, until it has a better representation of the global South. That isn't a contradiction. That's what happens when the system is set up in a way that your interests look ambivalent, but they're not. It's simply following your interests when you are in a subaltern position, right? So there's no ambivalence there. There's functioning with your interests in a system in which they don't reflect your interests. The structure doesn't reflect your interests, right? Middle powers, traditionally, the traditional ones, are small countries in their regions, right? Emerging powers generally are big countries in their regions, and they tend to, when they do change their horizon from a regional horizon to a global horizon, they tend to do so by looking at their regional leadership as a kind of trampoline towards the global arena, right? So these countries, they're often simultaneously leaders and followers in normative terms in the global system. So we can look at what these countries do. I'm going to summarize this slide a little bit. We can look at what these countries do, and we can say, okay, these middle powers, these emerging powers, they're kind of too small to really lead on their own, but they're also too big to simply follow, right? So the strategy that a lot of emerging powers adopt is to punch above your weight. You find little diplomatic niches that you do particularly well. In the Brazilian case, peace building based on exporting the experiences from home, right? And you try and use the multilateral system to punch above your weight on those issues and get more influence that then can bleed over into other, let's say, other tables at which you can sit, right? So in this sense, middle powers, emerging powers, even if they are questioning the hierarchy in the global system, they are the major beneficiaries of having a rules-based global order, right? And right, so there's a double guarantee for these states in the multilateral order. On the one hand, this kind of rules-based order protects against potential interference from larger powers, and at the same time, you can punch above your weight only in a system where it's one state, one vote. So that multilateral form, the way it's organized, is particularly useful for states who engage in this particular type of, let's call it, revisionism, right? So middle power conduct, then, these countries often lack the material wherewithal to go after their interests alone, and they'll compensate for that with a strong normative stance, which is precisely what Brazil has done on R2P, on the environment, on internet governance, on a series of different issues, right? So they seek to strengthen that rules-based order, but there is one kind of caveat to this, which is you need 2 other things that kind of ground this in reality a little bit. One is you do have to have a little bit of material power to back this up and to show, well, that it's not just do as I say, not as I do. And the niche that you choose, the area where you punch above your weight, has to actually make sense in terms of coherent thematic proposals that align with foreign policy traditions, right? So we see that happening, for example, in the Lula government fairly clearly. So I've already talked about too large to simply follow along. What does that mean for then emerging powers? And why is this going in the wrong direction? Here we go. What does that mean? What does that mean for emerging powers in peace operations? If we look at traditional Chapter 6 peace operations, the way they happened during the Cold War, these are kind of perfect windows for this kind of action because they don't violate any norms. They're not calling for the use of force. You can participate and show that you're contributing, right? They're based on peaceful conflict resolution, based on traditional sovereignty, based on regional leadership. They're based on things we like in South America, right? But what has happened to PKOs, what has happened to peace operations over the last 20 years, more force, more challenges to traditional sovereignty, more emphasis on military mandates, has made these missions a considerably more complicated proposition for countries in the global south. Aside from those on the African continent, you have to divide, I think, between Africa and South America in the sense that African countries sometimes don't have the same qualms about using force, and they do have more opportunity to make money from these missions, right? So in South America, or in Latin America, those have become more problematic as they've moved along, right? So as I said before, what that leads into is how do you interact then with these new peace operations? Well, you can use peace building, which kind of marries development and security together with this kind of individual focus on the local population. And you can have a backdoor to contributing to security, right? If you really want more international profile, you have to, it's the only place you're really going to get it is by contributing to international security, right? So you can use kind of development activities to secure or to have an effect in the security realm, right? So development matters have become much more in the global south, have become much more viewed as security matters in the global north, right? We invest in the global north, or they invest in the global north, oftentimes in development in the global south as a way not to develop the global south or out of love for the populations in the global south, but to stop people from coming to the global north as a question of security, right? So there's a kind of a duplicity there, right? And we can see that kind of there's a connection, a very strong connection between northern security and southern development. And then we have that question, as I said, of the division of labor and the root causes versus the pointy end of the stick. But it does give us a back door, as it were, to trying to do security using these development tools. So if we look then at the Brazilian context a little bit in terms of numbers, between 2004 and 2017, Brazil is between the 6th and 9th largest economy in the world, approximately just over 200 million people. If we look at kind of some of the internal hierarchy, the internal inequalities in Brazil, or the way the country is set up, it's a huge country, right? Like just the biggest municipality in Brazil is larger than the state of Coahuila here, right? And we have a municipal HDI that varies from Tanzania to the Netherlands, right? So there's so much variation internally. The country becomes a net aid donor during this time. They take on this leading role in MINUSTAH, and they start under the first and second Lula governments from 2003 onwards, really showing classic emerging power, sort of revisionist, global South-based behavior, right? Revisionist not in the sense of the rules themselves or the order themselves, but of, let's call it, Brazil's place in it, right? So I would kind of invite you to think sort of what are the parallels, potential parallels to the Mexican situation now? What are the parallels we can say? What would Mexico do differently based on its own traditions as well, right? So in terms of the Brazilian sort of diplomatic traditions, diplomatic preferences, the country is very strongly influenced by this history, a kind of formal and informal intervention by the United States during the Cold War, by European powers before then. So there's a very strong commitment to peaceful dispute resolution. Sovereignty tends to be interpreted as inviolability and as territorial integrity. There's a kind of a strong non-interventionist stance, and we see how that was some very important attempts were taken to work that out through the responsibility to protect and responsibility while protecting. There's a tradition of legal normativism that is very strong. It's very positive, but it also has a tendency to allow certain problems sort of for the can to be kicked further down the road, as it were. There's a strong internal emphasis on democracy and human rights, not, however, as a foreign policy, as democracy promotion. Extreme predilection for multilateralism, except for the last 4 years, perhaps. And a very strict avoidance of the use of military force. And I say that very strongly with the caveat externally, not internally. Internally, we have, unfortunately, a very problematic situation with the use of force in the small arms violence, for example. So on the whole, when it came to these intervention debates, until the responsibility while protecting initiative, Brazil was not particularly receptive to changes in the debates going on during this time. However, they become, and this is important, they become receptive when a window opens around MINUSTAH. And it becomes very clear that there are diplomatic gains to be made here, right? So there comes sort of this window for more influence, clearly, and also through security, and it comes at the price of essentially having to revisit the normative debate on intervention, right? So this ambiguity that I mentioned, that really isn't one. It's at the same time strengthening the order, but wanting to kind of shift the hierarchy within it, right? So Brazil and most South American states typically have tended to support peace operations, but not the robust ones in the past. And they've been present, with the possible exception of Uruguay, mostly with token contributions, mostly with individual contributions. So yesterday we were at Secopam, and they heard some of this discussion, and they said, well, it looks like we are starting off the same way that Brazil did after the 1980s, right? In the sense that we start with individual contributions, we move through contingents that have non-combatant roles before potentially moving into infantry battalions, right? So MINUSTAH was a real watershed for Brazil in this case. There was a very, very strong debate, particularly, I think, in the foreign ministry as well, over Chapter 7, or at least the foreign ministry was a strong player in that debate. And you had a lot of tension over R2P as the UN began to endorse it. So there was a real kind of clash between local norms and what was going on internationally. But at the same time, Brazil was in this situation. We're talking now about Lula 1 and Lula 2, the first two Lula governments, right? That government had a foreign policy narrative that was extremely attractive for being exported to other countries in the global south. So poverty reduction, hunger reduction, Bolsa Familia. I don't know if you've been following this, but Bolsa Familia was adopted even in Italy. So Meloni just actually ended Bolsa Familia in Italy last week. So they hung on with that for quite a long time. There was a very strong claim to representativity for the global south. There was a very strong remembrance in these pushes for, of historical factors such as the Cold War, of historical factors such as the colonial legacy. There was a strong desire to take up, obviously, also sort of a permanent seat in the Security Council, which is more problematic, but there's a strong desire to take on a role as an international bridge between North and South, as an international mediator, right? But the country in general has always been extremely supportive of and active in multilateral institutions, right? And so if we look at Brazilian hard power, then at this particular point in time, the Brazilian armed forces are huge. They're twice the size of the German armed forces, twice the size of the UK armed forces. Or at least they are at this time, right? At the same time, though, spending is very low, and about 70% of spending on the military goes to pensions and salaries. So there's some extremely generous perks for military officers in Brazil, right? So the equipment doesn't tend necessarily to be modernized. There isn't much of a projection capacity, but Brazil does have a Marine Corps as part of the Navy that's a fairly well-trained, or a very well-trained, actually, expeditionary force for projecting power. So Brazilian PKO contingents, they founded one joint large peacekeeping center, and then the Navy decided it wasn't so into joint and maintained its own. So they have two peacekeeping training centers that are both accredited by the United Nations, and PKO contingents tend to be extremely well trained. They do have the Marine, they have no heavy airlift, but they do have a small expeditionary force. So part of what they did in Haiti, part of the Brazilian presence in Haiti, had to do with also, beyond what they were doing in Port-au-Prince in their area of responsibility, was demonstrating we can pull off all the logistics by ourselves. We can reach the place with Air Force planes. We can reach the place regularly with Navy vessels, right? Which is something, if I understand correctly, not completely distinct or not so different from what happened, for example, in the case of Mexican nationals being evacuated from Haiti a couple of weeks ago. So there are parallels there as well, right? There are historical hurdles, obviously, in the foreign policy tradition to a very strong use of force, or to or that create an allergy to the term humanitarian intervention, right? But also another thing to remember is that we have in Brazil what by international standards could be termed incomplete civilian oversight over the military. They have a great deal of privileges, a great deal of prerogatives. They get away with a lot in terms of how they interact with democratic institutions. And, admittedly, a lot of this also is militarization by invitation by civilian policymakers, particularly the last 5 years, right? Now, the current situation is somewhat different, particularly after the previous government, particularly after what happened on the 8th of January, right? And so there's kind of a different relationship with the armed forces now, and there's even been an invitation to participate in the Haitian mission that's being built up, and the government has said, until we gain more trust again in the armed forces after what happened with the invasions of federal buildings on the 8th of January, we're not sending you anywhere, right? So there is this kind of similar tension or similar splintering of decision-making as there might be here between the foreign ministry, the presidency, and the armed forces themselves, who are not complete, in the Brazilian case, not completely still subordinate to civilian oversight in this policy-making aspect, right? So the most important diplomatic niche which Brazil had during this time, I don't know if the diplomats will disagree with me, in my view, sort of looking at foreign policy, this was during this time the Lula government's most important diplomatic niche. They could sort of one place where they could really be shown to be punching above their weight has been MINUSTAH, right? And it allows all these points to kind of be connected. This idea of contributing to regional security, being an international security actor, having a strong diplomatic presence, and bringing in all these other Brazilian agencies on development, on health, on even gender, right? We even had an engineering company, like the one being trained in Secopam now, that was used very effectively as a sort of public relations tool during MINUSTAH in Haiti, right? So we show being able to contribute to international security using tools not traditionally associated with the military or traditional security. So what are the characteristics of the way Brazil does peace building? Highly efficient military contingents, the integrated presence of various governmental offices. So it's kind of the reverse in the way it was played out of these whole of government approaches that Western countries do, where they kind of sew together a package in the capital and then send it to a place like Afghanistan. It was the opposite in Brazil. You had everyone coming to Haiti, and it was in the embassy in Haiti that it was frequently these programs were coordinated, but it ended up having a high degree of effectiveness. It was hampered by a kind of policy-making culture that doesn't encourage long-term planning, and by simply put, by money, in this sense, right? There's a political emphasis on local ownership in Brazilian peace building. So there's a political emphasis on legitimacy, on institution building, on sustainability, which is also very clear in what they're doing bilaterally, or we're doing bilaterally in Africa. And this allows Brazil basically to demonstrate what has been claimed to be a Brazilian way of peace building. In the sense that it allows Brazil to bring its own experience to bear, to export what it's doing well, without succumbing to others' definition, and to show relevance in the security area in that sense. Right? I'm going to skip over these and look directly at an empirical look then at the Brazilian case, and that's our last part we'll look at today. Empirically, this is a couple of years old, and this is from the country profile that was done by this Providing for Peacekeeping project. We see sort of a relatively large armed force, relatively decent sort of projection capacity, low spending for the defense budget, a return back down to 49th place. Brazil, during the height of MINUSTAH, had actually been in the top 10 contributors with about 2,200 troops. A lot of token contributions, and one large one in UNIFIL in Lebanon, right? And we can see as well these different deployments that Brazil has been through. So we can divide Brazilian participation in peace operations essentially into three periods. 1956, so UNEF, the first armed deployment, although we do have earlier deployments. Brazil starts contributing to international missions even during League of Nations times, in Leticia and in other places. But the first kind of armed UN mission is UNEF, the Emergency Force in Suez, in 1956, until the beginning of MINUSTAH in 2004, then the period of MINUSTAH to 2017, and then from 2017 to the present. So there's always been this really strong commitment to multilateralism, and the conflict resolution and conflict security participation starts early in the UN in 1947 with the Special Commission on the Balkans. Now, just to sort of give you a kind of anecdotal idea of where Brazilian contributions go, in terms of how peacekeeping has grown, there's an expression that is used in sort of, peacekeeping nerd circles or UN circles, chapter 6.5, sort of missions that are somewhere between chapter 6 and chapter 7. That term is often attributed to Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN security. It actually comes from a Brazilian diplomat on USCOB. Ciro de Freitas Vale came up with that expression. And there's been sort of several key moments in kind of the conceptual development of things like peace building, particularly where Brazil hasn't been prominent on the ground, but it has been in New York City. So the general pattern during this time has been kind of token individual contributions, such as, or individual, let's just leave it at individual, such as Mexico is making now, right? With liaison officers, staff officers, etc., with four major exceptions. So UNEF, they had about 1,000 men in the field constantly from 56 to 67 in a combat role, in a patrolling role, but under Chapter 6. Then in Mozambique in the 90s, in UNAMARS, in Angola in the 90s, in the UNIVEMs, in non-combat missions, so field hospitals and things like that. And then finally, a largely policing mission done by police, mostly from Brasilia, in UNTA at the Transitional Administration in East Timor. And we can kind of see that after UNEF, there's a pattern here, right? Brazilian troops during this time, these are all Portuguese-speaking countries, Mozambique, Angola, East Timor. So there is kind of this idea that we operate by close contact with the population. We operate by cultural affinity, and our way of doing business is particularly effective where our soldiers can recognize the way things happen, the way things work based on the way it looks at home to them, right? That means that if you send Brazilian troops to a place that looks like that, they're going to be way more effective than, say, Germans, right? But if you take them out of a context where that's the case, you put them in in Sudan or in Mali, that the effect may be the contrary. It may be harder to export to there. So it's a very context-specific, shall we say, augmentation of effectiveness. So Brazilian participation in MINUSTAH, this is, I have entire 4-hour mini courses just on MINUSTAH, so I'm really kind of shutting this down here, or making it shorter. But in 2004, Brazil is invited to take over a leadership role in Haiti. Typically, force commanders, the commanding generals of these missions, tend to rotate every 6 months between countries or 12 months between countries. In the case of MINUSTAH, they were always Brazilians for the full 13 years. The Brazilians had the largest contingent, 1,300 before the earthquake, 2,200 after the earthquake in 2010, and constantly the force commander. About 55% of the troops in the mission came from Central and South America. So there was even sort of a Latin American leadership role there that boiled over into other mechanisms for coordinating defense policy. And this was kind of a very strong image campaign for Brazil. It was accompanied by $1.3 billion in bilateral aid and all kinds of projects that had to do with bilateral contributions from Brazilian state agencies. Quickly, we can look at a timeline of Brazilian contributions. It's obviously sort of there we have the two African missions I was talking about, and then the 1st and 2nd battalions in Brabachis in Haiti, and then now we're at about 200. It's in up until 2020 with the contribution to UNIFIL. We do have some specific issues with, if I could get the slides to move, with MINUSTAH. So what did the Brazilians sort of learn? What problems did they face? They had a problem with tactical leadership training, so the 3-block sergeant, that kind of thing. The integration with civilian action, the integration with foreign policy objectives, sort of the armed forces and diplomats talking to one another. We had the question of, unfortunately, a very strong feedback from what the army was doing in Port-au-Prince and then coming back and wanting to do it in Brazil. So there was this question of, well, we know how to do urban policing now. We know how to do urban patrols. So why aren't we doing that internally in Brazil? And we have, as a legacy of MINUSTAH, a very strong rise in armed forces involvement in policing in favelas in urban contexts in Brazil, which has had not only positive effects for various people living in Rio de Janeiro and elsewhere. We had, as I mentioned, the engineering company as a kind of a PR tool. It was very strong. They were originally supposed to only contribute to building things for the mission, for the Brazilians, for other contingents in the mission, but they were used very strongly by the Brazilian contingent to build things for Haitians as well throughout the city. This was originally not, the UN originally was not very happy about this, but by the end of the mission, they came around. And it does need to be said that there's been a kind of a turn in the way this mission has been evaluated in public debate after the involvement of some of the higher profile commanders in the previous government. So we do see, however, this is sort of pictures from the UN itself. They were relatively quickly able to assert military control over the city. And this was at the time where we had kind of these militarized gangs, very similar to what we have now. So in military terms, they were, in fact, relatively effective. And I'm coming very close to the end here. I know I'm going over a little bit. The next contribution that we have after this is UNIFIL, so a maritime contribution. There's about 200 soldiers of the Marine Corps who were placed on a Brazilian ship, and as well as the overall command of the maritime part of UNIFIL in Lebanon. They were doing a blockade against Hezbollah. And they stayed there for about 10 years, about 9 or 10 years. And there had always been kind of continued discussions over the deployment of a land contingent, mostly to replace either Spain or Italy, that never materialized for various reasons. And then finally, to close, when we look at kind of potential deployments for Brazil, the decision-making process is still from 1956, and it requires kind of a serious overhaul. But very differently from here, it very strongly favors the foreign ministry at the moment, or at least the foreign ministry has a very strong ability to say no, which it has used in the past to refuse or to reject a certain number of deployments, such as Haiti, again, Central African Republic, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, about 20 years ago, when these interventions were very strongly desired by the armed forces, actually. So finally, what's the future of Brazilian participation? The current government, as I said, still, I think, has to regain a little bit of trust in the armed forces in order to give them this mission again. The armed forces themselves are extremely interested in this. It's very good for them. It's a prestigious mission. It's good for money, right? There's still a very different geopolitical context. There's much less agency, I think, for emerging powers with the Gaza conflict, with the Ukraine conflict, with the blockade in the Security Council, particularly based on Ukraine. So there's a lot less room for this, but we do need to regain trust in the armed forces again a little bit more. There is still domestic experience to be brought to bear, and we have to look at, I think, also what the long-term effect of a potential Trump administration will be, what the long-term effect of this move towards stabilization, this move away from Latin American priorities is going to be. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much. Questions?
Yeah, there are some questions, yes.
Oh,
but if you want, I'm going to read it.
Sure.
Okay. Please light on. Okay. Yes, from el Colegio de México, Ariana Hernández. She asks, can peacekeeping operations be used by emerging powers to gain some level of autonomy or become less dependent? And to what extent and where does this stop? How can Brazil regain power/recognition in multilateral fora in a post-Bolsonaro diplomacy?
Right, so there's two elements of that, obviously, right? Like the first one, I think this is sort of my personal analysis now as an academic who looks at this. I think peace operations are more useful for demonstrating that you can have an effect within certain structures and try to change those structures from within than they are in gaining autonomy, right? You're very constricted by that UN practice, by that UN model when you're in peace operations, and it's very difficult to sort of gain autonomy. So can you just what was the second question again? Can Brazil regain power and recognition in multilateral arenas in a post-Bolsonaro diplomacy? That question's a little off the topic, but again, I believe that Brazil has, and I'm saying this not just because they're sitting here, but I mean Brazil has very capable diplomats. They have diplomats who are proactive and who have invested a lot in maintaining multilateral institutions. And so there's been a movement, I think, to keep day-to-day diplomacy going very strongly, even during those 4 years, right? And now it's obviously a difficult proposition to regain that kind of status or recognition after those 4 years, but particularly because there was a concerted, very targeted attempt to destroy particularly what Brazil was good at in diplomacy in a certain sense, right? But let's put it this way. I think, you know, if someone can do it, it's your Brazilian colleagues.
Okay, there is another one in Spanish. I'm going to translate in English.
I can probably understand it in
Yes,
Spanish.
okay. ¿Usted cree que las misiones de paz, ya sean peacekeeping o peacebuilding, actúan como una manera de influir políticamente sobre otros países? ¿Considera que hay objetivos, entre comillas, escondidos detrás de estas misiones de paz?
Again, that's a big sort of question of interpretation. I think that when you have these questions like humanitarian intervention or peacekeeping, 100% altruism doesn't exist. And everyone has to sort of define for themselves how much altruism is enough for them. So you can kind of look at a NATO operation and say, no, we don't want NATO to do anything, but they may have some sort of positive effect somewhere. So who do you sort of distrust more, NATO or the leader there, right? So I think countries are always going to have motivations for engaging in peace operations that go beyond the local situation. From there to saying, you know, there's hidden interests in why a country would enter is a leap, though. So has it happened in the past? Absolutely, right? Rwanda was a strong contributor to MONUSCO and MONUC. And this was why? Because they had enormous armed forces after their civil war. They supported certain factions, and they occupied 1/3 of Congo's, of DRC's territory. So yes, in some cases, particularly where you have to recruit, like in Africa from neighboring states, there's absolutely an agenda, right? And I myself just said in the presentation, right, you're contributing in peacekeeping is a way to secure, to get an outcome that's more amenable to your interests. So yeah, true altruism, 100% altruism, I don't think exists in international politics, but I think peacekeeping more frequently than not is an example of a practice in which altruism is a strong motivating factor together with influence.
Well, there is another question regarding hate. Well, I'm going to interpret the question. What can do Brazil and other Latin American countries do in Haiti, given the situation of that country right now? And
well,
given the experience of the Brazilian armed forces in the participation of the UN peacekeeping operation in that country.
Haiti is a very complicated case, as you know, as we know from sort of looking at the international community trying to solve it for literally the last 30 years. So I'm not going to solve it in 30 seconds either. But I would say that one of the things that often I think doesn't come to the fore enough is that in order for Haiti to change, the Haitian government itself, or the Haitian government structures, the Haitian elites themselves, have to want for there to be change. And the fact of the matter is the Haitian elites are perfectly happy with things the way they are now. So if you can't, so in order for the international community to do anything, you need domestic partners. You need domestic desire for change as well, right? And so there's, I think, a strong role for an accompanying diplomacy there, and not just a military intervention. So to see what the possibilities are for sustainable change, and what the opportunities are for other forces to come to the fore in that country.
Now I have a question for you. I didn't see in your presentation the following. There is the need of congressional approval for sending troops, Brazilian troops in the UN peace process.
Yes, but it comes relatively at the end, right? There's a whole, so by the time Congress is involved, you're at a fairly advanced stage in the negotiations already between the capital and New York. And there's also one thing to be said about that is, differently from a lot of other contributors, there isn't a lot of interest in the Brazilian Congress in sort of getting too involved in these issues. They're not seen as issues that win votes. They're seen as issues that could lose you votes, but won't win you in. So you have a relatively low level in the Brazilian Congress, in both chambers, of kind of specialized knowledge on these issues, right? So that may be less of a loss in empirical terms than some other cases. But the Congress is involved fairly late in the process and not as prominently as it might be elsewhere, I would say.
And given the political polarization in Brazil, you mentioned, for example, the assault on the political institutions, the presidential palace, the Brazilian Congress, the Supreme Court. Is there any consensus in the political party among the political parties for a new participation of Brazil in peacekeeping operations?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I think you have those political elements that were supporting the previous government because they're hostile to multilateral institutions in general, and because they have a very kind of clear alt-right foreign policy alignment, aren't interested in that. They would support the armed forces if the armed forces were to come out more publicly and more clearly and say, like, we want peace operations, right? And I believe for the same types of reasons, the current government is still finding its footing geostrategically, and I think it's also still kind of, as I said, sort of waiting to regain trust in the foreign presence of the armed forces before it sends them again.
Okay, thank you very much.